The first territory bell had not yet sounded when Alara heard Beta Garrick lie. She was crossing the treaty hall with a tray of fresh ink, sand, and folded cloths when his voice carried over the long table. The northern boundary runs east of the Splitstone marker, then follows the ridge to the river descent. Alara stopped, so suddenly the ink trembled in its wells. East of the Splitstone marker. The phrase should have meant nothing to a maid. To her, it meant the line on the table was wrong. Years earlier, when the old archive keeper's hands had begun to fail, Alara had spent winter evenings helping him flatten water-damage surveys and copy fading boundary notes before the ink vanished. The Splitstone marker had appeared again and again in those records. Its position did not define the boundary by itself. The carved face did. She looked toward the map spread between Alpha King Rowan and the visiting delegation. A narrow black line crossed the northern mountains. From where she stood, she could not tell whether Garrick had misstated the map, whether the map itself had been drawn incorrectly, or whether memory was betraying her. But she knew one thing. The wording he had used would move the boundary across a thin mountain corridor. Garrick rested one hand beside the treaty seal. Calm. Certain. He had negotiated borders for Rowan since before Alara had entered palace service. Across from him, the rival delegates gave no sign that anything was unusual. Your Majesty, Garrick said, if you acknowledge the surveyed line now, we can proceed to final terms before the third bell. Rowan reached toward the document. Alara's pulse slammed against her throat. She could stay silent. A servant interrupting a sovereign negotiation could lose more than a position, and accusing the king's beta without proof was worse. But if Garrick's wording became the accepted description, every later argument would begin from the wrong line. She set the tray down. The small sound of silver touching wood vanished beneath the hall's murmurs. Your beta is lying. Silence struck the room. Every face turned toward her. Garrick did not move. Rowan's hand stopped above the treaty. For one terrible second, Alara wished he would look angry. Anger she understood. Instead, his expression sharpened with controlled attention. Come forward, he said. The guards beside the wall shifted, but Rowan lifted 2 fingers, and they stayed where they were. Alara walked to the table. Garrick's gaze settled on her with almost courteous interest. That is a serious accusation. I know. Then explain it. Alara pointed to the northern line without touching the parchment. The Splitstone marker does not define the boundary by where it stands. The old surveys follow the direction of its carved face. If your description is used, the line moves west across the corridor. One of the rival delegates frowned. Garrick finally smiled. Not nervously, confidently. He turned to Rowan. Then perhaps we should show the Maid the current survey. Garrick signaled to a treaty clerk, who unlocked a narrow case beside the table and withdrew a rolled survey bound with black cord. He opened it across the older map and placed 2 fingers beside the northern boundary. There, he said. Alara leaned closer. The line followed exactly the interpretation Garrick had just described. For a moment, the room seemed to narrow around the parchment. Then she saw the authorization at the bottom. Rowan's seal. The rival delegate who had frowned before now sat back. The boundary was already approved by your king. It was, Garrick said. He did not sound triumphant. That made it worse. Rowan studied Alara. Is this the survey you challenged? I had never seen this copy. But the line contradicts what you remember? Yes. Garrick folded his hands. Then we are delaying a sovereign negotiation because a maid remembers an obsolete map. A few counselors shifted uneasily. Alara kept her eyes on the survey. Something about it disturbed her beyond the boundary itself, but she could not yet name it. Garrick continued. If any servant may interrupt a ratified negotiation by claiming an older record says otherwise, no agreement made in this hall can be trusted. The first territory bell sounded. Its deep note rolled through the stone chamber. Alara felt the deadline become real. Rowan looked from his seal to Garrick. How long have you used this survey? Throughout the negotiations. And I authorized the package. You did. The answer carried years of confidence between them. Garrick had stood beside Rowan through disputes Alara knew only from servants' conversations and archive records. Rowan could have ended the matter there. Instead, he asked her, how do you know the old boundary system? I helped Keeper Tomas restore damaged surveys when his hands became too weak for the work. I copied descriptions, marker symbols, and orientation notes for 3 winters. You were trained as an archivist? No. I was a maid assigned to help him. Garrick gave a restrained breath. Which proves my point. Alara finally understood what had been bothering her. The wording. Rowan's gaze returned to her. She indicated a phrase written beside the splitstone marker. That description is old survey language. Garrick's expression remained unchanged. Alara continued. If this were simply a modern survey replacing an obsolete convention, why copy the old terminology exactly and change what it means? The hall quieted again. Rowan read the phrase himself. Garrick said, because legal descriptions preserve historical language even when surveying standards change. Then there should be a record of the change. There is. Let me see it. Garrick's eyes hardened for the first time. One of the rival delegates pushed back his chair. We will not hold negotiations indefinitely while your household investigates itself. Rowan straightened. You won't have to. He looked at Alara. The final transfer becomes binding only when the seals are exchanged at the third bell. Until then, you may substantiate your accusation. Garrick turned sharply. Rowan, that is my decision. Then Rowan's voice lowered. If you fail, Alara, disrupting a sovereign treaty carries formal punishment. My willingness to hear you will not erase that. She swallowed. I understand. Good. Then find evidence. Garrick began rolling the survey closed. As the parchment curled beneath his hand, Alara saw the archaic phrase disappear beside a boundary line that should never have interpreted it that way. Old maps became obsolete. Old rules could change. But someone who had copied those words knew exactly where they came from. Someone who had copied those words knew exactly where they came from. That thought followed Alara into the archive annex. Rowan assigned one of the treaty guards to accompany her, a woman whose uniform bore no insignia from Garrick's negotiation office. The guard unlocked the records room and remained beside the door while Alara went directly to the boundary shelves. She did not have time to search everything. The modern survey had used an old phrase, so she searched for the phrase first. Dust clung to her fingertips as she opened index volumes and compared reference numbers. Several older surveys described the splitstone marker exactly as she remembered it. Each treated the carved face as directional authority. Then she found the wording from Garrick's current survey. Almost exact. Alara read both entries again. The new document had preserved the historical description while reversing the orientation attached to it. Not modernization. Someone had known enough about the old system to make the alteration look legitimate. She called the guard over. Witness this. The woman approached without touching the book. Alara indicated both entries. The language is preserved here, but the direction changes in the current survey. I want the originals to remain in this room. The guard nodded. I'll record where they were found. Alara left them open on the table. Footsteps sounded outside. Rowan entered alone. Anything. Enough to show the discrepancy was constructed by someone who understood the archive. Not enough to prove Garrick did it. Rowan looked at the two records. Who had access? His negotiation office would have. Treaty clerks too. Possibly others authorized to prepare surveys. So your accusation is still ahead of your evidence. Yes. She hated admitting it, but refusing would make her no better than the people she was accusing. Rowan's gaze stayed on the pages. My seal is on the current survey. Alara looked at him. Did you inspect this boundary description before you authorized it? A pause. No, you signed it. I approved. The negotiation package from Garrick's summary. The answer was quiet, without excuse. Alara closed one index and pulled another toward her. Then your seal proves authorization. It doesn't prove the line is right. His jaw tightened, but he did not rebuke her. Together they traced the changed boundary across the surrounding survey references. The land itself seemed almost worthless. No village. No mine marked in the surviving records. No broad road or fertile valley. Just a narrow mountain corridor enclosed by steep terrain. Rowan frowned. Why falsify a boundary for that? I don't know. That frightened Alara more than discovering obvious wealth would have. If someone had risked a sovereign treaty to alter the line, the corridor mattered. She searched the index for its older designation. The sequence jumped. Alara checked again. One entry should have stood between two numbered records. It was gone. Not crossed out. Not damaged. Removed. Only a faint cut along the binding showed where the page had once been attached. Rowan saw it too. What would that entry contain? The reference to the survey that explains why this corridor was recorded separately. Can you find another copy? Maybe. From the treaty hall beyond the archive walls came the muffled movement of negotiations resuming. Alara stared at the missing page. Someone had not merely changed a line. Someone had tried to make certain no one remembered why that line mattered. Alara searched the remaining indexes for the missing survey number, but every reference led back to the gap. Then, in a trade ledger stored beside the boundary records, she found 3 older notations for winter supply movements through the same northern district. They were indirect. None explained the corridor itself, but one detail caught her attention. The rival pack's negotiators had requested the Western interpretation of the boundary twice during preliminary talks. Alara straightened. They know. Rowan looked up from another ledger. Know what? That the corridor matters. You don't know why it matters. No, but they keep insisting on the interpretation Garrick gave them. That proves they want the land. It could prove more. Rowan closed the ledger. Say exactly what you mean. Alara hesitated only a moment. Garrick may be working with them. Silence settled between them. Evidence? Rowan asked. The altered survey. Their insistence on the same boundary. Garrick controls the negotiations. That proves opportunity and shared preference, not coordination. You trusted his summary enough to put your seal on it. And that was my mistake. Rowan's voice hardened. I won't correct it by accepting another conclusion without proof. The words struck because they were fair. Alara had found a lie in the boundary. She had not found Garrick's motive. Before she could answer, the treaty guard stepped inside with an order bearing the council stamp. Archive access is restricted until the negotiations conclude. Alara stared at the parchment. On whose request? Beta Garrick presented the matter to the treaty officials. He argued that continued unsupervised searching could compromise protected negotiation records. I haven't been unsupervised. I know. Rowan took the order, read it, and his expression darkened. Garrick had used Alara's accusation exactly where it was weakest. She had moved from demonstrable alteration to an unproven claim of conspiracy, and he had turned that overreach into procedure. The guard began closing the open volumes. Alara watched the evidence disappear beneath their covers. From the treaty hall, voices rose as delegates returned to the table. Then the second territory bell sounded. Its note rolled through the archive walls, deeper than the first seemed to have been. 2 bells. Only one remained. Alara looked again at the winter supply notations. Winter, not ownership. Something Keeper Tomas had once complained about surfaced in her memory. Old records were never arranged according to what later clerks thought was important. A road could appear in a military ledger, a boundary in a tax book, a mountain passage in emergency records. She turned toward the far end of the annex. Rowan noticed. What? The missing survey may not be our only record. The archive is restricted. The boundary archive is. Alara pointed toward a sealed inner corridor. Emergency winter passage records were kept separately because they governed movement during storms, not territorial ownership. Rowan followed her gaze. Beyond that door might be nothing. Or the reason someone had altered a map, removed an index entry, and risked a treaty to acquire a strip of mountain nobody was supposed to value. Alara faced him. If you want proof before the third bell, that is where we have to look. Then we look there, Rowan said. The treaty guard glanced at the council order. Your Majesty, the restriction applies to her archive access. Rowan held out his hand. I will take custody of the search. It was not a declaration that Alara was right. He did not tear up the order or command everyone to believe her. He simply placed his own authority behind one narrow chance to find evidence. The guard unlocked the inner corridor. Alara led Rowan into a colder chamber where emergency records were stored in shallow wooden cases. She remembered Keeper Tomas explaining why they had been separated. Ordinary boundary surveys established possession. These records existed to keep people alive when winter made ordinary routes useless. They searched by district first, then by the old designation attached to the splitstone marker. Alara found the reference in a cracked winter ledger. Northern Emergency Passage. Rowan came beside her. The entry described seasonal movement between settlements when heavy snow closed the main northern road. The narrow mountain corridor on Garrick's treaty map was not barren land without value. It contained the only reliable winter passage between those settlements. Alara felt cold settle beneath her ribs. If the boundary moves, she said, we lose control of this. Rowan read further. But passage rights remain. Yes. That made no sense. If Garrick intended to cripple Rowan's territory for the rival pack, why preserve access at all? Alara pulled a second record from the same case. Earlier negotiation notes referred to the corridor as marginal ground. One annotation discussed the rival pack's interest in consolidating an untidy border, with no mention of the winter route. She read it twice. Her certainty from the outer archive began to collapse. They don't know, she said. Rowan looked at her. The rival delegation. I thought their insistence on the western line meant Garrick had told them what the corridor was worth. She touched the annotation. But these negotiations treat it like useless territory. If they knew this controlled winter movement, they would bargain differently. So Garrick isn't simply giving them something they asked him to steal. No, the admission cost her pride, but the evidence mattered more. Rowan did not remind her that he had warned her about assuming motive. Instead, he said, then what does Garrick gain? Alara continued down the entry. A later clause governed situations in which territorial ownership belonged to one pack, while seasonal passage remained guaranteed to another. Disputes over access were not settled automatically by either alpha. They required a recognized cross-pack intermediary. Alara stopped. Rowan read over her shoulder. The office was not named in the old record. It described a function, one negotiator accepted by both sides, empowered to certify passage conditions and resolve access disputes. Alara thought of who had shaped the current treaty, who had carried Rowan's summaries between councils, who had spent months becoming the familiar voice at both tables. Garrick. Not proof yet, but the question had changed. Rowan exhaled slowly. I let him carry too much of this. Alara turned toward him. I trusted his summaries because he had earned that trust over years. And now I know my trust allowed an altered boundary to reach my table. There was no defense in his voice. Alara closed the winter ledger carefully, then corrected the decision. His eyes met hers. That's simple. No. She handed the record to the treaty guard so its custody would remain witnessed. That necessary. For a heartbeat, something in Rowan's expression softened. Not gratitude exactly, and not the authority with which he had first ordered her forward. Respect. Then Alara looked back at the passage clause. The rival pack wanted land. Rowan wanted a treaty. And whoever controlled access after the transfer could stand permanently between them. The second bell had already sounded. Before the third, they had to discover why Garrick wanted to become that man. Alara returned to the passage clause while Rowan examined the treaty notes beside it. The mechanism was clearer now. Ownership of the corridor would pass to the rival pack, but Rowan's settlements would retain seasonal crossing rights. Every winter closure, disputed convoy, delayed patrol, or questioned traveler could therefore become a negotiation between two territories. And someone would have to certify the terms. Garrick doesn't need either side to lose, Alara said. He needs both sides unable to use the passage without him. Rowan's face went still. The rival pack would believe it had gained territory. Rowan's council would believe it had preserved access. Garrick could present every future dispute as another reason his position was indispensable. He built himself into the agreement, Rowan said. Yes, not as the rival alpha's servant, as the man both alphas would eventually need. Footsteps approached from the outer chamber. A treaty official appeared at the doorway, visibly tense. Your Majesty, the delegation has reconvened. Beta Garrick requests your return. He says further delay may be treated as withdrawal from the negotiated terms. Rowan took the winter record from the guard only long enough to read the relevant clause again, then returned it to her custody. We have the altered interpretation and the passage record. Alara shook her head. That proves the change matters. It still doesn't prove which boundary interpretation legally controls. Rowan looked toward the door. I can stop the signing. You can. And risk transferring nothing. That isn't the only risk. He understood before she finished. If Rowan canceled a treaty he had already authorized based on an accusation that still lacked decisive proof, Garrick could make the dispute about the king's reliability instead of the altered boundary. They returned to the treaty hall. Garrick was waiting beside the map. You found more old records, he said. Rowan's expression hardened. Records showing that the corridor controls winter passage. A murmur moved through the chamber. Several rival delegates exchanged startled looks. Alara watched them. Their surprise confirmed what the archive had suggested. They had expected land, not leverage over Rowan's winter route. Garrick recovered first. The treaty preserves passage rights. Through an intermediary, Alara said. His eyes shifted to her. An office you have positioned yourself to occupy. This time Garrick did not smile. But he did not collapse either. He placed Rowan's authorized survey on the table. Then we have speculation about my future influence, he said. And a king considering repudiating a boundary he already approved. He turned so both councils could hear him. If His Majesty overturns his own authorization because a maid has produced older records, what prevents him from overturning any provision after the agreement becomes inconvenient? The rival delegates went silent. Garrick had changed the battlefield. Alara's evidence showed danger. It showed manipulation. It even showed who stood to benefit. But the king's seal remained on the current survey. The legal boundary is the authorized boundary, Garrick said, unless someone can prove that its interpretation is false. Rowan could command the hall. He could not command proof into existence. Alara looked at the archaic phrase beside the black line. The carved face. The answer had been inside her first warning. The split stone marker, she said. Rowan turned. The original marker still stands on the boundary. The wording on both surveys refers to it. If we verify the direction of its carved face, we can establish which interpretation the language describes. How far? Close enough to reach before the bell if we leave now. Not close enough to waste time. Garrick's jaw tightened. Alara saw it. For the first time, he was afraid of something that existed outside his paperwork. Rowan looked at the treaty, then at the doors leading toward the northern boundary. He could destroy the agreement with authority. Alara needed him to do something harder. Give her the chance to prove why he should. Give her the chance to prove why he should. Alara stepped toward the treaty table. If I challenge the authorized boundary formally, Garrick cannot claim this is only your change of mind. Rowan understood the cost immediately. And if the marker supports his interpretation, the challenge falls on you. Yes. The treaty officials were listening now. Alara forced herself not to look away. I accept liability under the treaty challenge provision. A counselor drew a sharp breath. Garrick's expression settled back into control. You understand that His Majesty cannot protect you afterward without compromising the same law you are invoking. I understand. If she was wrong, she could lose her place in the palace, her standing in the pack, perhaps even her right to remain in Rowan's territory. Rowan came around the table. I won't order you to do this. You aren't. His gaze held hers for a long second. Then he lifted the sealed treaty map. Garrick moved. That document cannot leave this chamber. It can under sovereign custody with neutral witnesses. Rowan handed the map to the treaty guard who had accompanied Alara in the archives. You will carry it. 2 treaty officials will witness the marker. Whatever they find will be entered into the record. There would be no quiet rescue if Alara failed, and no quiet suppression if she succeeded. They left immediately. The boundary route climbed north through steep ground toward the disputed corridor. At the first fork, the escort instructions directed them toward the western trail. Alara stopped. That route is wrong. One of the officials stared at the written directions. These came from the negotiation office. Garrick's office, Rowan said. Alara studied the terrain. The western trail curved around the ridge. It would reach the boundary eventually, but not the old marker before the third bell. She remembered the survey contours she had copied years ago. The eastern cut. There is no marked road there, the guard said. There wasn't supposed to be. The survey path follows the drainage until the stone rise. Rowan looked at her. Certain. No, it was the only truthful answer. But the western route costs us the bell. He nodded once. Lead. Alara did. The eastern cut was narrow and rough, but the terrain began matching the old surveys. Drainage hollow, exposed ridge, then 2 leaning pines above a shelf of gray stone. Her lungs burned when she saw the split marker. It stood waist-high, cracked through the center exactly as the archive drawings had shown. The officials gathered around it. Weather had softened the carvings, but not erased them. Alara brushed loose grit from the stone without touching the carved grooves. There, a shallow directional face angled across the rock. The treaty guard unsealed the map and held it beside the marker while both officials checked the archaic description. One traced the line with his finger. The maid's interpretation matches the carved face. No one spoke for a moment. One had shown that the language was altered. He too had shown why the corridor mattered. Now the land itself answered the remaining question. The authorized survey had reversed the marker. Alara closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. She had been right. But being right here was useless if the proof arrived too late. A distant bell mechanism began its warning sequence from the treaty compound. Rowan looked south. How long? Not long enough for the western trail, Alara said. He turned toward the eastern cut they had just climbed. Then we go back the way she brought us. The guard resealed the treaty map. The two officials recorded the marker's orientation and signed beneath each other's witness statements. Alara looked once at the split stone. Her job, her standing, and perhaps her home had rested on which way that weathered carving faced. Now Garrick's future rested on whether they could reach the hall before the final bell finished what his altered map had begun. Now Garrick's future rested on whether they could reach the hall before the final bell finished what his altered map had begun. Alara entered the treaty chamber behind Rowan as the warning sequence ended. Garrick was already standing beside the treaty table. The witnesses have returned, Rowan said. The room went still. The treaty guard placed the sealed map on the table. The two officials stepped forward with their signed record of the splitstone marker. Garrick glanced toward them. The third bell is due. We cannot postpone a sovereign agreement every time another historical detail appears. We don't need another delay, Alara said. She went to the map. The current survey preserves the old boundary language but reverses the orientation attached to it. That is the first fact. She indicated the winter record now held under witnessed custody. The emergency archive establishes the second. This corridor contains the reliable winter passage when the northern road closes, and the treaty separates ownership from passage rights. Several rival delegates stared at the map differently now. Alara turned toward the two officials. The third fact is outside this hall. The original splitstone marker still carries its directional face. These witnesses compared it with the treaty language. One official raised his signed statement. The carved orientation matches the historical interpretation presented by Alara. The authorized survey reverses it. Garrick's face tightened. Then he looked at Rowan's seal. The king authorized that survey. I did, Rowan said. Then it remains the sovereign document unless you intend to declare your own authorization meaningless whenever someone questions your judgment. The first strike of the final bell mechanism sounded. Garrick pushed the treaty toward Rowan. Complete the agreement. Rowan did not touch the pen. Instead, he removed his authorization seal from beside the survey and placed it in the center of the table. I suspend my authority over this treaty, pending formal review of my authorization and Garrick's negotiation conduct. Shock moved through both councils. Garrick stared at him. You would place your own decision under investigation? Yes. For her. Rowan's gaze did not leave him. For the evidence. The distinction struck harder than any declaration could have. By surrendering the protection of his own approval, Rowan stripped Garrick of the argument he had used all afternoon. The survey could no longer hide behind the king's signature while Garrick alone challenged. Everyone beneath it. The treaty officials began comparing the custody record. The altered map had passed through Garrick's negotiation office. The winter clause preserved Rowan's passage rights while requiring a recognized intermediary when disputes arose. Garrick had positioned his office to perform that function. The rival delegation had expected marginal territory. Rowan had expected secure access. Only Garrick's position benefited from both sides misunderstanding what the arrangement would make necessary. You weren't serving them, Alara said quietly. Garrick looked at her. You were making both pacts dependent on you. He offered no confession. None was needed. The map, the archive record, the marker, and the documented negotiation structure said enough. The final bell rang. No seals were exchanged. No valid transfer was completed. Rowan ordered Garrick removed from negotiation authority and placed under guard pending formal judgment. Garrick did not resist as the guards approached, but the composure he had carried since Alara's first accusation was gone. The rival delegates demanded immediate clarification. They will receive it, Rowan said, after every boundary record is verified independently. Then he turned to Alara. Hours earlier, she had stood before the same table with nothing but a memory everyone had reason to dismiss. Now the altered survey lay open between them, its false line exposed before both packs. Rowan did not tell the hall that she had saved him. He did something Alara valued more. He stepped away from the map and left the evidence in front of her. He stepped away from the map and left the evidence in front of her. The territory transfer was formally suspended before nightfall. The rival delegation agreed to reopen negotiations once the disputed boundary records had been independently verified. Without exchange seals, there was no completed transfer to undo. Garrick remained under guard awaiting formal judgment. His negotiation authority and office were revoked pending that process. Rowan did not pretend removing one man repaired the weakness that had allowed the altered survey to reach his table. Future territory agreements would require independent review of boundary records before receiving royal authorization. No single negotiator would again control both interpretation and presentation. For Alara, the change was more immediate. 3 days later, Rowan summoned her to the records chamber. A corrected territory map waited on the table. Beside it lay an appointment assigning her formal authority to review boundary and archive records for future negotiations. Alara read every line before looking up. "You're giving a maid authority over royal surveys?" "I'm giving the work to the person who proved she can do it." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Better answer." Rowan came around the table, but stopped with space between them. "The position is yours if you want it. Nothing attached. Nothing. My believing you does not purchase your trust." His voice softened. "Or anything else." Alara understood what he was asking without allowing rank, gratitude, or the intensity of the past days to answer for her. "I don't know what this becomes." "Neither do I. But I'm willing to find out." Rowan nodded, accepting exactly what she had offered and nothing more. Then he turned to the corrected map. The splitstone boundary had been restored according to the carved face Alara remembered from those winter evenings in the archive. Rowan picked up his pen. For an instant, she saw the treaty hall again, his hand moving toward a document, Garrick beside him, and Omega made expected to refill the ink and remain silent. This time Rowan stopped. He turned the map toward her. Alara examined the boundary description, checked the orientation, and followed the line through the mountain corridor. Only when she was satisfied did she slide the map back across the table. "You can sign it." Rowan lowered the pen. And this time, the Alpha King waited for her judgment before he trusted the line.